Welcome to Unbound, the podcast with Beth Curry, author, storyteller, and survivor. This is where books meet real life, where Beth reads chapters from her work and breaks free from the traditional audiobook format, diving deeper into the personal experiences, lessons, and liberation behind every page. Nothing is off limits. Let's get unbound.
Hi, welcome back to Unbound. I'm Beth Curry, wrote the book, reading the book, whatever. Today's chapter is about discovering someone who made me feel safe for the first time while still living under the shadow of an abusive relationship. It's a story of trust and fear and the complexity of love in trauma. This is chapter 6 in the book, Love and the Landmines. By April of 1990, I'd become an expert at making myself invisible. I could slip through the hallways of M.M. Robinson like a ghost, navigating between classes without drawing attention, avoiding eye contact, keeping my head down. I'd perfected the art of existing without taking up space. But even ghosts sometimes get cornered. I was at my locker one afternoon when Jeff and his crew decided to make me their entertainment. The usual stuff, comments about how I looked, jokes about who would be desperate enough to date me, the kind of casual cruelty that had become background noise in my life. What I remember most about that day wasn't what they said. It was what happened next. This incredibly tall guy, easily 6'4", appeared seemingly out of nowhere and positioned himself between me and my tormentors. I'd never seen him before, which was impossible in a school where everyone knew everyone. He had to be new. But what struck me wasn't his height or the fact that he was obviously confident. It was the way he never took his eyes off me while he dealt with them. Like he was making sure I was okay before he worried about anything else. He didn't threaten them or start a fight. He just existed in their space in a way that made them suddenly aware they weren't the biggest predators in the ecosystem anymore. Within minutes, they'd found excuses to be somewhere else. When they were gone, he asked if I was okay. Not in the performative way people sometimes do when they want credit for being decent, but like he genuinely cared about the answer. His name was Nate. He'd just moved with his parents and brother from Australia and needed to pick up a couple of credits he needed for university. And for the first time in a good while, I felt safe around another human being. Like immediately safe. I felt a trust I didn't think I could feel. There was some cosmic sort of connection between us that I still cannot explain to this day. Over the next few weeks, Nate started showing up in my orbit. Not in the aggressive, possessive way Brandon did, but naturally, like he was just happy to see me. He'd ask about my day, my classes, whether those guys had bothered me again. When I said they hadn't, he'd nod like he'd expected as much. There was something about Nate's presence that seemed to create a bubble of safety around me. Word traveled fast in high school. Mess with the fat girl and you'd have to deal with the giant from Australia who was only here temporarily to finish his credits. Most people decided it wasn't worth the hassle. For the first time since grade 7, I could walk through the hallways without constantly scanning for threats. But Nate's protection came with an unexpected complication. He seemed to actually like me. But it wasn't like the calculated, manipulative way I was used to, where every interaction felt like a transaction. Nate genuinely seemed to enjoy my company. He'd laugh at my jokes, my actual jokes, not the self-deprecating ones I used as armor. He'd listen when I talked about books or music or whatever random thing I was thinking about. He made me feel like I was worth knowing. And that fucking terrified me. Because I was still with Brandon. At least I thought I was. The boundaries of what had become so blurred, so twisted by months of psychological manipulation that I didn't know where the relationship ended and the abuse began. In hindsight, I now know that we were never even in a relationship. He was not my boyfriend, and I was not his girlfriend. What I did know was that Brandon had made it very clear that other guys were off limits, that talking to them was a betrayal, that even friendships were a threat to what we had together. But being around Nate felt too good to give up. For the first time in months, I remembered what it felt like to laugh without checking over my shoulder first, to have a conversation that didn't feel like navigating a minefield. So I did what traumatized people do. I compartmentalized. I had Brandon, who I thought was my boyfriend, but also on some level knew he wasn't. Brandon, who demanded more from me than I was ready to give, who made me feel constantly on edge, but who I believed loved me. And I had Nate, who felt like safety, who asked for nothing, but seemed to see something in me worth protecting. I thought I could keep them separate. I thought I could have both, the relationship I thought I wanted and the friendship that made me feel human again. I had no idea that Brandon was watching, planning, getting angrier by the day. As grade night ended and summer began, Nate and I had developed something that felt an awful lot like a real friendship. He'd started driving me home sometimes if he had access to a car, which was both a relief and a source of anxiety. Relief because it meant I didn't have to walk alone, anxiety because I knew Brandon wouldn't approve if he found out. Nate never pushed for more information than I was willing to give, but he was clearly curious about my life, about why I seemed so nervous all the time or why I'd look over my shoulder when we talked. He never asked why I always seemed to be waiting for something bad to happen. I wanted to tell him about Brandon so badly, it hurt. I wanted to explain why I couldn't just be normal, why I couldn't relax, why I jumped at unexpected touches and flinched when people raised their voices. I wanted to start lying to him like I was to others, to try to get him to ask the right questions, but I just couldn't. Brandon's threats echoed in my head every time I opened my mouth. His friends who were capable of murder, what happened to people who crossed him, the consequences for my family if I said too much. So instead, I told Nate nothing about that and more about me. I told him about my skin condition, about the bullying, about feeling invisible most of the time. I told him about my friends Kelly, Sally, and Shauna, who he already knew, but I hadn't realized it. About books I loved, about wanting to travel someday. I told him about all the safe parts of my life while carefully editing out the part that was slowly destroying me. Nate listened to everything with a kind of attention that made me feel like my words were worth saying. He never tried to fix things or offer solutions I hadn't asked for. He just witnessed me, saw me, made me feel like I was worth knowing. It was the first taste of unconditional acceptance I'd had in years, and it made me realize just how conditional everything with Brandon had always been. By September, the weight of living two completely separate lives was crushing me. At school, I was Nate's friend, the girl who laughed at his jokes, who felt safe walking the hallways with him nearby, who remembered what it felt like to be treated with kindness. Outside of school, I was Brandon's victim, the girl who jumped when her phone rang, who made elaborate excuses to avoid going places where he might find me, who lived in constant fear of what he might do next. The cognitive dissonance was destroying me. How could I be safe and terrified at the same time? How could I be loved and abused simultaneously? How could the same person who felt like salvation also feel like destruction? I started having panic attacks, insomnia. I'd lie awake at night replaying every interaction with both of them, trying to figure out which version of reality was real. The version where Nate cared about me and Brandon was dangerous, or the version where Brandon loved me and Nate was the threat. Brandon had spent so long convincing me that his version was the truth that even when I was with Nate, even when I felt genuinely safe and cared for, part of me wondered if I was the problem. If I was leading Nate on the way Brandon claimed I'd led him on. If I was being unfaithful to someone who loved me. The gaslighting had worked so well that I couldn't trust my own perceptions anymore. All I knew was that I was drowning, and I didn't know how to save myself without destroying everyone around me. That's when I made the mistake of thinking I had choices. In January of 1991, after months of feeling safer and more like myself when I was with Nate, I decided to tell Brandon I didn't want to see him anymore. Hindsight is funny because, like I said, I wasn't even seeing him. What a fool I was. What a fool he knew I was. I thought it would be simple. I thought I could just explain that things weren't working out, that we wanted different things, and that maybe we should just be friends. I thought I was in a relationship that I could choose to leave. I had no idea I was pretty much a prisoner trying to fire her warden. The conversation didn't go the way I'd planned. Brandon did not accept my decision with the mature understanding I'd somehow convinced myself he'd show. Instead, he looked at me like I'd just declared war on him personally. "This is about that new guy, isn't it?" he said, and there was something in his voice that made my blood go cold. The tall one who thinks he's your bodyguard? I tried to deny it, tried to make it about anything other than Nate, but Brandon wasn't buying it. You think I don't see you with him? You think I don't know what's going on? The conversation escalated quickly from there. Brandon grabbed my arm hard enough to leave bruises, pushed me against a tree, got so close to my face that I could feel his breath when he spoke. You don't get to just walk away from me, he said. That's not how this works. That's when I understood that what I thought was a relationship had never been a relationship at all. It had been a captivity that I'd somehow convinced myself I'd chosen and willingly stayed in. And now that I was trying to leave, Brandon was done pretending I had any say in what happened to me. The physical violence I'd been afraid of, the violence he'd only hinted at before, became a regular occurrence. Shoves that sent me stumbling, punches and grips that left marks. But worse than the physical pain was the psychological warfare that came with it. Brandon made it clear that Nate was now a target, that my betrayal had put him in danger. That if anything happened to Nate, it would be my fault for choosing him over someone who'd loved me first, someone who was kind to me when nobody else was. I was trapped between protecting someone who'd shown me kindness and staying with someone who I now realized had never cared about me at all. The late winter and early spring of 1991 became a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Nate and I had started spending more time together, which should have been wonderful, but instead filled me with constant terror. Every moment of happiness felt stolen. Every laugh felt dangerous. Every kind word he said to me felt like evidence that could be used against him later. I couldn't tell Nate what was happening because telling him would put him in more danger. I couldn't tell my parents because Brandon had made it clear what would happen to my family if I involved them. I couldn't tell my friends because I'd spent so long lying about everything that I didn't know how to start telling the truth. So I carried the weight of protecting everyone I cared about by letting Brandon continue to destroy me. It was devastating. For the first time in my life, I had someone who cared about me unconditionally. And I couldn't let myself accept it because accepting it might get him hurt or even killed. Nate knew something was wrong. He'd ask gentle questions about bruises I couldn't explain and why I seemed so scared all the time, about whether someone was hurting me. He didn't understand why the day he came over to hang out at our side deck with me, I made a huge production about needing him to leave. Even my dad got involved without even knowing what was going on. He just knew I needed this guy to leave and he was being a bit stubborn about it. I was terrified Brandon would walk by and see us. I wanted to tell him so badly that it felt like my chest might cave in from the pressure of keeping the secret. But every time I opened my mouth to try, I'd hear Brandon's voice reminding me what happened to people who crossed him. So I lied. I deflected. I made excuses. And I watched the confusion and hurt in Nate's eyes as he tried to understand why the girl he cared about kept pushing him away. In March, before everything shattered completely, my family took our first trip together, a 2-week trip to Florida for spring break. For those 2 weeks, I got to pretend I was just a normal teenage girl. My sister and I spent our days together like we used to, before secrets carved distance between us. We went to movies, we went go-karting, I ran on the beach acting silly and carefree, screaming Beach Boys songs at the top of my lungs like some kind of idiot. The wind and the waves drowned out everything else. For these moments, I wasn't Brandon's victim or Nate's friend or anyone's problem. I was just me. I had fun with my parents and grandparents. Real fun, not the performed version I'd gotten so good at. I even convinced my family I had a huge crush on my aunt's boyfriend's son, another tall tale of protection, another safe crush that existed far away from the confusion of my real life, another lie I could hide behind. But even there, even in paradise, I couldn't fully escape. I missed Nate, constantly, which terrified me because missing him meant he mattered. And if he mattered, Brandon's threats meant something real. And the more I missed him, the more I convinced myself it was all in my head anyway. Why would someone like Nate actually care about the stupid fat girl with bad hair and no makeup? The girl with no personality who was nothing but a liar at the end of the day. By the time we returned home, I'd fully convinced myself that he probably hadn't even noticed I was gone. that whatever I thought we had was just another delusion in a life full of them. I wasn't expecting him to give a shit about my return. I definitely wasn't prepared for what actually happened. Nate had noticed. He'd more than noticed. While I'd been gone, something had shifted for him. He didn't just want to be my friend anymore. He wanted more. He made that clear almost immediately. He had missed me too. Shortly after that is when it happened. Our first time. Neither of us knew what we were doing. We were both virgins fumbling through something that felt important, even if we didn't have the words for why. It wasn't planned, and it wasn't anything like the movies made it look. It wasn't candles or music or whispered promises. It was his kitchen floor on a random afternoon. It was clumsy and awkward and tender and real. It was two teenagers trying to find comfort in a world that made at least one of us feel small. I remember the coolness of the linoleum against my back, the way the afternoon light filtered through the huge windows in the other room, making everything feel both exposed and somehow sacred. For me, it was more than sex. It was the first time someone touched me without taking something from me. Nate didn't rush, didn't pressure, didn't make me feel like I owed him anything. He treated me like I was allowed to exist in my own body, like I wasn't broken or ruined or too much. I remember the way he looked at me, not with hunger, but with something like awe, like he couldn't believe I was choosing to be there. And for a moment, neither could I. And I also couldn't believe he was choosing to be there, with me. But almost immediately, the shame crept in. Not because of him, never because of him, but because Brandon had trained me to believe that every choice I made belonged to him. I lay there afterward, on that kitchen floor, caught between safety and guilt, wanting to hold on to the feeling, but already hearing Brandon's voice in my head. If I could go back and tell that version of myself anything, it would be this. You weren't doing something wrong. You were reclaiming something that had been taken from you, the right to be touched with kindness. It was messy and human and imperfect, but it was also sacred in its own small way, a moment where love briefly outweighed fear. I had maybe 3 days of feeling like my body belonged to me before everything got worse. Brandon had noticed the shift between Nate and me. Whatever restraint he'd been showing before disappeared completely. The threats escalated, the calls became more frequent, more aggressive. He was watching me more closely, following me more often, making sure I understood that I didn't get to choose this. The illusion of safety I'd felt on that kitchen floor evaporated almost immediately. But that was nothing. Because then, in June of 1991, 2 of my friends died. The first was a car accident. 4 kids from local high schools, speeding along Roller Coaster Road. Airborne, hit a tree, explosion, gone in an instant. The second happened the night of a memorial gathering. Another friend walking home alone, taken from our neighborhood by someone who turned out to be a serial killer. Though we didn't know about the serial killer part then. What we also didn't know, my sister and I actually had an encounter with this man ourselves when we were hanging out in front of the variety store not 2 minutes from where our friend was taken from her own property. In the space of 1 week, I learned that the world could take people away without warning, without reason, without giving you a chance to say goodbye. And all I could think about was how much worse it would be if something happened to Nate because of me. Brandon's threats weren't just words anymore. People I knew were actually dying. The possibility that he could follow through on what he'd promised didn't seem so far-fetched anymore. I even started to wonder if Brandon was the one who abducted and murdered our friend. The mind works in the most fucked up ways when you're young, abused, scared, and quiet. The grief and the terror combined into something I couldn't carry anymore. By Christmas break of grade 11, I was done. Done with school, done with trying to protect everyone, done with living in constant fear. I told my parents I was dropping out. It was the most direct I had ever been with them. It was me putting my foot down, not the other way around. They were devastated, confused, desperate to understand what had gone so wrong with their daughter who'd always been such a well-behaved girl. I couldn't tell them the truth, that staying in school as long as Brandon was there too meant putting Nate in danger, and that leaving was the only way I knew how to protect him and probably myself. So I made up a story about being overwhelmed, about needing time to figure out what I wanted to do with my life, about school just not being the right fit for me anymore. It wasn't entirely a lie. I was overwhelmed. I did need time to figure things out. I just couldn't tell them that what I was really trying to figure out was how to disappear myself completely so that everyone I loved could stay safe and I might be able to exhale for the first time since I started high school. I dropped out of school in January 1992, thinking I was saving Nate from Brandon's violence. What I didn't expect was that someone else had been watching. Someone had been paying attention to the elaborate stories I'd been telling, the erratic behavior, the desperate attempts to get help without asking for it directly. Mr. Campanaro was the gym teacher, younger than most of the staff, popular with the female students, respected by the jocks. He had a way of seeing through teenage bullshit that most adults missed. Apparently, he'd been putting pieces together, the fake boyfriend stories, the way I talked about being afraid, the increasingly frantic behavior before I disappeared from school altogether. A few weeks after I dropped out, my parents got a phone call that changed everything, or at least it could have. "Is this about Beth's fiancé?" Mr. Campanaro asked my mother. "Did he break up with her? Is that why she left school?" My mom was confused, then concerned, then terrified. "Fiancé? What fiancé? What was he talking about?" When my parents confronted me about the call, I could see the hope and fear warring in their eyes. Hope that someone might finally have answers about what was wrong with their daughter, fear about what those answers might be. I was so close to telling them everything, so close to letting the truth spill out, to finally getting the help I'd been desperately trying to signal for. But that very same day, Brandon had cornered me and told me exactly what would happen to my cats if I ever involved my parents. He described in graphic detail how he would hurt them, how he would make sure I watched, how it would be my fault for not keeping my mouth shut. So when my parents asked about the gym teacher's call, when they begged me to tell them what was going on, when they offered to help with whatever I was facing, I looked them in the eyes and lied. "He must have gotten confused," I said. "You know how rumors spread at school. People make up all kinds of stories." It was me. I was the people making up all kinds of stories. I watched the hope drain out of their faces. I watched them accept that their daughter was just going through some kind of phase they couldn't understand. Mr. Campanaro had gotten closer to the truth than anyone else ever had. He'd seen through my desperate performances and recognized them for what they were, a cry for help. But Brandon's threats were louder than my need to be saved. I chose my cat's safety over my own rescue. I still regret it to this day. I had no idea I was about to discover just how far Brandon was willing to go to maintain control over me. And I had no idea that the worst was still to come. What's actually true? When you're being abused, every relationship becomes complicated by the abuse, including relationships with people who genuinely care about you. Love doesn't automatically cancel out trauma or erase the effects of ongoing abuse. You can be deeply loved by someone while simultaneously being destroyed by someone else, and your nervous system will be confused about which reality is true. The push-pull between Nate and Brandon wasn't about choosing between two boyfriends. It was about trying to hold on to hope while managing terror. Trauma makes it almost impossible to trust good things because your brain is scanning for the danger it knows is coming. When someone offers you genuine love while you're being systematically destroyed by someone else, accepting that love can feel like betrayal of your survival instincts. Your inability to fully receive love, or in my case, my inability to fully receive Nate's love, wasn't about deserving it. It was about being too afraid to believe it was real. What good things have you pushed away because you were afraid they were too good to be true? What love have you rejected because your trauma brain couldn't believe it was safe? Permission slip. I am allowed to accept love even when I'm scared. I'm allowed to be loved while I'm healing. I'm allowed to trust good people even when bad people have hurt me. I am allowed to believe that not everyone who offers love is trying to hurt me. You don't have to heal completely before you're worthy of love. This week, accept one gesture of genuine care without questioning the giver's motives. Practice receiving love as someone who deserves it. All right, so this chapter highlights something that many survivors of abuse recognize. Trauma complicates even the healthiest relationships. For me, Nate's presence was a lifeline. He was someone who genuinely cared without conditions. But the nervous system doesn't immediately know safety. Like, because I thought this and I even wrote it. I thought this about Brandon. I thought he was a lifeline and I thought he genuinely cared without conditions. But then I saw what that really looked like. But yeah, my nervous system doesn't immediately know safety. So when you've been living in a state of constant threat, your nervous system kind of becomes hyper-tuned to danger. But sometimes, rarely, you encounter someone whose presence actually calms that alarm system instead of triggering it. You want to trust that instinct. Your body knows the difference between someone who wants to hurt you and someone who wants to protect you, even when your mind is too confused to tell the difference. When you've lived under fear and manipulation, your brain is hyper-vigilant too, right? Safety feels kind of fleeting and kindness feels suspicious as fuck and love can trigger guilt and it's awful. And, for me, that push-pull between Nate and Brandon wasn't about choosing the right person. It was about navigating survival while my instincts were wired for danger. And trauma makes it hard to trust your own perceptions. When someone has systematically convinced you that their version of reality is the only truth, it becomes nearly impossible to recognize what healthy relationships actually look like. So if you've ever found yourself confused about whether something was love or control, or if someone was protecting you or possessing you, you're not crazy. Gaslighting is designed to make you question your own judgment. So trust the relationships that make you feel more like yourself, not less. What's also important, I think, is understanding the difference between conditional and unconditional care. Manipulative people make you earn love, and trauma makes you question love itself. Genuine care, which is what Nate showed to me, does not demand transactions. It doesn't punish mistakes and it doesn't isolate you. It's really simple in principle, of course, but it's radical for someone whose boundaries have been completely violated. And the difference between manipulation and genuine care is pretty stark once you know what to look for. Manipulators make you feel like you have to earn their attention or like their love comes with these terms and conditions and shipping and handling and all that stuff. People who genuinely care about you make you feel accepted as you are, not as who you might become if you change enough things about yourself. My compartmentalization, trying to maintain a Brandon life and a Nate life is common in abuse. I mentioned this in an earlier chapter. I said, pay attention to me separating my life in two parts or pieces, like completely sectioning things off and living these separate lives. The mind naturally separates danger from relief and fear from safety to survive, So the panic attacks, the insomnia and the guilt and all that shit that I went through, these aren't signs of weakness, I felt like it at the time. I thought, what is wrong with me? Why am I falling apart? But it's evidence of a nervous system that's constantly scanning for threats. And then bringing gaslighting into it again, it doesn't just make you question specific events, right? It makes you question your entire capacity to understand reality. Like when someone has convinced you systematically, again, I use that word a lot, that your perceptions are wrong, it becomes almost impossible to trust your own judgment about anything. And if you've ever felt crazy, or if you've ever wondered whether you could trust your own memories and instincts, if you've ever felt like you were losing your mind, that's not necessarily mental illness. It could very well be psychological abuse. Your confusion is not evidence that you're broken. It's evidence that someone worked very hard to break your connection to your own truth. This is how abusive people maintain control, right? They make you feel responsible for their violence, basically. They convince you that their reactions are your fault and that you caused their anger by making the wrong choices. So if someone has ever made you feel like you made them hurt you, like their violence was a natural consequence of your behavior, please know that no one makes someone else abusive. Abuse is a choice that abusers make. Their violence belongs to them 100%, not you. This chapter, I think, also reminds us of the ripple effects of trauma, right? Like even moments of joy, like trips or my first time with Nate, friendship, all of that. It comes with anxiety because abuse teaches you that safety isn't real and happiness is conditional, which is ridiculous. And the heartbreaking reality of that is that even when rescue is available, fear can make it impossible to accept help. When someone you love is being abused, their behavior might not make sense to you. They might seem like they're choosing their abuser over you. like they don't want your help, like they're pushing you away for no reason. They're not choosing their abuser at all. They're trying to protect you. You can love someone in an abusive situation by just being patient and staying available and making it clear that you're there whenever they're ready. And you know what? I didn't see it at the time, but that's what Nate was doing. And he didn't even know my situation at the time. But don't take their distance personally. You know, they're not rejecting you. They're just trying to keep you safe. That's all. Sometimes the most loving thing too someone can do is remove themselves from your life, even, when it doesn't make sense to you or even when it hurts both of you. So if someone you care about suddenly distances themselves, especially if they seem scared or anxious, just consider that maybe they might be trying to protect you from something that they can't tell you about. So don't take that personally either. Just love them from wherever, they need you to be. Another thing, sometimes the people who could save us are right there, asking the right questions, seeing through our lies to the truth underneath. But trauma makes us choose the devil we know over the salvation we're not sure we can trust. If you're watching someone you suspect is being abused, don't give up after one conversation. Keep asking and keep showing up and keep making it clear that you're there when they're ready. Sometimes it takes multiple attempts before someone feels safe enough to tell the truth, and sometimes, heartbreakingly, they never do. And if there's one takeaway too, it's this: love doesn't cancel abuse. Trauma doesn't make kindness feel safe, but noticing the difference between harm and care and learning to trust a body that's been taught to distrust itself, I think that's the first step toward reclaiming your life. I asked a question at the end too, that's worth reflecting on. I think, what good things have you pushed away because you were afraid that they were too good to be true? What love have you rejected because your trauma brain couldn't believe it was safe? That's not just my story. It's a question for anyone who's ever been conditioned to fear safety and joy. Thanks for being here. Please make sure to follow me wherever you listen to me so that when new episodes drop, you'll be notified. Remember, all episodes of Unbound are free, but if you want to support the production costs, you can find me over on Ko-fi. There's never any obligation. The content will always be free. Support and contact info is in the show notes. And if you join the Facebook group, we sometimes have further conversation there as well. So there you go. I will see you in the next episode.
Thanks for listening to Unbound with Beth Curry. Join the conversation in the Facebook group or visit author.bethcurry.com. Want to support the show? Head to ko-fi.com/unbound podcast. Until next time, stay unbound.